Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, Kyle Buller and I talk to Dre and John from Voices in the Dark podcast, a very interesting and cool podcast out of England. And we talk to them about treating autism with MDMA and LSD. One of them, Dre, I believe, treated his autism through his own research with MDMA and LSD and is working to develop some sort of protocol that really might help people in the adult autism world. So it was a very interesting conversation. I think you're really going to like it. So check it out and let us know what you think. We have put together a special offer for you all out there. If you buy our Navigating Psychedelics course, you get a $30 credit on our store so you can scoop up a t-shirt. The class comes with hours and hours and hours of education, along with access to a secret Facebook group, and also an integration workbook and a trip journal. So a lot of great stuff are included in there, and yeah, check that out. We're also starting to offer live supported dates. So we're going to give you that class, Navigating Psychedelics class, and I'm going to run a session with 4 live supported classes where we can get together in a class format for 4 weeks and talk about it. Kyle's putting one together where they're going to meet 6 weeks in a row. Sorry, not in a row, over time. So check that out, psychedelicstoday.com to learn more. And you can find it also at psychedelicstodayshop.com. So I hope you check that out and hope you enjoy the episode. If that's a little bit too much money on those classes, maybe just help us out by leaving a review on iTunes or Facebook. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. We really appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Welcome back to Psychedelics Today with your hosts, Joe and Kyle. Today we are here with John and Dre from the Voices in the Dark podcast. I was actually on their podcast where you guys recorded with me a few months ago, and Dre had an interesting story about using psychedelics to help with his autism, and thought this was a pretty fascinating story, and we agreed to bring him on the show to talk a little bit more about this. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you guys want to maybe just fill in some gaps and give us a little background about what you guys do?
Yeah, sure. We met through another podcast, kind of knowing Dre was working on the podcast at the time, and I went along as a fan, and we started hitting it off. And it was around that time that I'd had a cataclysmic breakup with my then boyfriend, and was really, like, I think a lot of people who come to podcasts, you're kind of looking for something, a sense of connection, a sense of that other people are doing interesting, cool things with their lives, and it helped me anyway escape the bubble of angst. And along the way, I was discovering like these things called psychedelics, and turned out Dre had a lot more experience in that realm and helped me understand them better as a tool for personal growth. And I ran off to the jungle and drank ayahuasca, and that was like going from 0 to 100 very quickly. But it was really then his knowledge after I came back from there that I kind of developed a longer running therapeutic connection with psychedelics, which a lot of which was based off Dre's personal experience of how he'd used them to help himself and other people.
Yeah, you'd come back from the jungle full of positive kind of lessons and feeling like things were going to get better, and then quickly they didn't for you. And you ended up in Washington, right, with the research job?
Yeah, well, everyone washes up. Yeah, I was meant to be in Washington, D.C., about to start a research gig at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And as it came closer and closer, I was just realizing more and more, no, I don't want to do this. And it became a bigger, no, I don't want to do this, towards the whole of the career path, I guess you could call it, that I was on in the academic world. And whilst that was bubbling to the surface as kind of truth of how I felt emotionally, and it's something I feel doesn't get talked about enough when people say, like, I took a psychedelic, I got this big insight, is that the big insight could be that you're doing your life wrong, and that's really, really unsettling. And so it took a lot of extra work, especially facilitated by Dre, for me to be able to digest and understand what that meant.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact wording of the conversation, but we were talking on Skype and I said, look, come back. Let's start a podcast. We're going to talk about these things, because we both wanted to do that anyway. And on top of that, in between the time we're recording, we're going to do, and you ended up calling it Dre therapy. So sort of a set of psychedelic mediated steps to try and, in John's case, overcome depression and certain negative feedback loops of thoughts that made him feel trapped.
And did you have any experience with psychedelics, Dre?
So my own personal experience was self-mediated. I'd been mucking around with them for about 2 years at that point. I'd come to them from having reached a point in life where I had like a friend of mine likes to call them annus horribilis, terrible year, where everything went wrong. I was unable to hold down a normal 9-to-5 job. I just kept either quitting or just finding myself in situations where I had to leave. I lost my long-term relationship, and I realized that my life just wasn't going the way I wanted it to, and that probably I was the problem because the same situations kept happening to me with different people, where sometimes I couldn't connect to them or I would be inconsiderate, but more often than not, I just couldn't read them, and so they didn't like me, and so I didn't get promoted or I didn't get opportunities. And so I decided to try and fix my autism, or at the very least, find ways to overcome some of the more severe symptoms in terms of not being able to recognize social cues or understanding people, and that sort of thing. And that's where I came to sort of read up on, through extensive hours and hours on the internet, about certain things, including some of the effects of MDMA and the effects of psychedelics on the brain. Now, this was at a time when there was very little research in terms of their beneficial effects to autism in particular. But based on my understanding of neurochemistry and neurophysiology from my biomedical degree, I thought that they would be quite useful. At least they could be. So I first set out and tried MDMA. And that was a very sort of important first step for me because it unlocked emotional empathy. It made me understand music, and it just sort of opened a few doors and windows in this featureless white room that I didn't know I was in. So I could look outside. It was an initial kind of like, oh, there's more than what my brain is currently capable of. I can perceive it now.
And how old were you when you had your first experience?
Like 29, I think, maybe 30.
Okay, so this is kind of like a little later on.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm 35 this year in September. So it's been an interesting journey. But yeah, so the MDMA was very, very powerful, very important. I thought I had empathy because I felt bad when people had bad experiences, but that's what I like to call logical empathy. It was more of I know that they're not having a good time and I wish that they did, but it's a very thinky experience. Whereas actually feeling their pain, that's something I had never felt before until MDMA came to the picture. That was a very, very powerful window on a whole shade of human experience that I'd never been able to touch upon.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a very qualitative change in the way my brain worked.
Yeah, because I mean, that's like one of the cornerstone type of symptoms of people on the spectrum, right? Is like kind of like that not being able to pick up on some of the social cues or like being able to feel some of that empathy. Like it's just kind of like seems kind of logical, or maybe I don't know, maybe you can describe that a little bit more since that's more in your realm.
It's a weird sort of situation to describe to as the term goes, neurotypicals, because the most often referred to kind of expression, or certainly what media tends to say, is that we don't have emotions. Whereas that's not necessarily the case. It's probably more that we are less in touch with those and what they are, but also we are less able to see them in others and recognize them. And it might actually be related to feeling too much rather than not enough. A lot of autism is sensory overload.
Yep.
As far as emotions are concerned, we see potentially too many things in other people's faces to be able to make sense of the real ones. There's too many conflicting signals. And so the net result is that you don't perceive the correct one. But it's not that you're unable to see things. It might be that you're seeing too many and the brain is just kind of going, nope, I'm out.
Yeah, it's like too overwhelming to process. It sounds like.
But this made a big difference. I started to see, like, in a couple of experiences I watched a couple of movies when they're under the influence. And I could see what the actors were feeling or what they were communicating. I was like, oh, look, they're sad. It just made sense. And it started to sort of fall into place. But it wasn't until I sort of played around with LSD that it truly all started to come together.
Interesting. Do you mind digging in a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I was fascinated by what it could do in terms of cognition and sort of expansion of mindset, but also intelligence augmentation. I was sort of reading into a couple of bits of research by a researcher here who I've met a few times called Robin Carr-Harris, who studies. He works for Imperial College in some of the psychedelic sciences. Very, very interesting stuff. And so I decided to try it. And I took it on my own first time by myself, sort of an experimental control fashion, very artistic way to do it. And it just, as if MDMA opened doors and windows for me, LSD allowed me to walk out into the rest of the world and the universe. Mm-hmm. And it just felt like all these different things were connecting and computing and falling into place, as if, it's hard to describe, but essentially all the sensory inputs and information that I had absorbed over my lifespan were finally computed. The backlog had been the bottleneck had been removed. And so all the information was being processed and filed correctly. And I ended up sort of trying and ramping up and experimenting with different dosages, going up and down, doing some truly sort of mega doses, and then going back to doing sort of, macro doses, but nothing crazy, which is where I like to sit at the moment. But it was certainly important to go as high as I could to get certain things, because there's certain things I think you can only experience when cognition is almost blasted to oblivion and it has to rebuild it.
And what were some of those mega doses for you? So
this was, it was, at the time I was on tabs. I've now moved on to liquid LSD, but at the time I was doing tabs, and I think I did 5 or 6 tabs of quite strong acid. And it was very, very powerful experience. And on top of that, it was quite overwhelming. And so I decided, I'll have a little bit of weed to chill out, because in the past that had helped out. Problem was that the person I got weed off didn't have the usual normal low-grade weed. And so he sold me some hash instead, which I'd never tried. And instead of calming me down, it seemed to compound. It sort of exponentially increased the effects of the weed and of the LSD, and the LSD exponentially increased the effect of the weed. And it just blasted my mind into nothingness. It was weird. I was helping someone else who was having a worse reaction than I was to this experience. And that was quite a difficult preoccupation for me. But the moment they were fine and they chilled out from the difficulties they were having, and I was able to let go, instantly my mind disappeared, my ego dissolved, and I was bathed in sort of my own consciousness at its rawest form. And what that felt like was as if each neuron had been kind of de-linked from every other neuron in my brain. And so I was experiencing the cognition of each individual cell separately. But slowly, as the effects ebbed, it started to rebuild itself. And each sort of network and group of cells and overarching groups of groups started to rebuild and reconnect. And so I was experiencing things like the fact that in the back of my head, I'm still hearing sounds and songs that I experienced as a child, constantly playing in the background, but they're drowned by everything else that's happening to me. Or the fact that part of my attraction to women was informed by certain things like the cartoon Betty Boop. like little childhood things that imprint on you. and sort of we're being sort of uncovered, because once you strip everything away and it has to rebuild itself, you were getting each layer upon which each layer was built, getting back to who you are. And once it was kind of almost fully rebuilt and I was able to experience my thoughts, what happened is it felt like I experienced every lifetime of every life form that was in my ancestry up until me, and then past it till the end of the universe. And then finally I came back to, and I could see the room again for what it was, and I was awake again. And that was probably the most powerful experience I've ever had. And I think there are a few the ones that would compete with that, but that was the biggest reboot ever. It made huge differences and had huge long-term impacts that it's hard to describe.
Yeah, when you have those types of experiences, they are really hard to put into words. Like you can really, it's for me, it's like more of like a feeling and like kind of associated with memories. But yeah, trying to really put some of these things into words is probably one of the hardest things to do, because it's just so personal. And
that's up to 900 micrograms, by the way, on the high end. 900 micrograms.
Sorry, what's that?
It's about 900 micrograms on the high end. I ran the math.
Yeah.
That's really intense.
Yeah, something like that. That was quite a lot.
It's a big range of possibility, but yeah, that's that's wild and fascinating. Sorry, Kyle, for cutting you off there.
No, that's cool. You got anything, Joe?
Well, I like this concept of imprinting from childhood and like kind of like feeling those as layers. I think that makes a lot of sense and is really a valuable concept. And yeah, like LSD experiences I think all psychedelic experiences are difficult to put into language. Like McKenna called it, Englishing or whatever. And, that it's hard to English this stuff. And yeah, I don't know. Like it's a fascinating story. And I really appreciate how you laid that out for us.
Yeah. And ultimately, long term, the effects that have stayed with me is just a sense of peace and calm within myself. It takes a lot more from the universe to give me sensory overload of any kind and cause anxiety of any kind. So I'm better able to listen to people, understand where they're coming from, because I no longer have to understand myself. And so it's no longer a preoccupation. And just a lot of patience and ability to connect and to integrate and to know what I want.
Well, kind of where I want to go from here is like, how did you come up with this idea of a particular kind of deliberate protocol of healing people through various psychedelics and treatments?
So with my own experiences, all the different things that I've tried. I've described a few, but there was also mushrooms in there. I've tried ketamine, a couple of opioid things, but also researched more into each and why and what they do to neurotransmitters in the brain, which areas of the brains they activate, and so on. I was just curious. I come from a scientific background, and I'm interested in how the mind works. It's always been a very, very interesting topic for me. And so when I was faced with people I cared about or I was interested about having cognitive difficulties, I felt like the answer was in being able to remove certain aspects of the mind or accentuate certain aspects of the mind in a way that allowed the mind to repair itself and effectively the cognition to figure out a way to process information. In particular, I was interested in things like removing fear from ideas or memories. I was looking at research on PTSD and MDMA and why it was effective, why veterans taking MDMA are able to effectively be cured of PTSD. And it seems like the answer was that during an MDMA experience, your amygdala and the fear centers of the brain are kind of shut off. And so when they're made to recall the trauma without fear, the trauma is able to actually be expressed and processed, and then you kind of let go of it. Whereas when the fear sort of spikes up to like 1,000,000% every time they think about that thing that happened to them, it goes in a recursive loop, and it just keeps sort of being buried before it's fully expressed. And so it just keeps sort of repeating itself. So understanding and learning about little loops like that made me think that it would be useful to treat depression, for example, by starting with MDMA therapy to remove fear and anxiety around whatever the problem is at the moment. And so you can delve deeper and bring to the surface the actual ideas and problems that have originated the state that the person's in right now, because often the symptoms, go further back in time or are unrelated to what the person's currently preoccupied with. And it was just a bit of trial and error on myself and a bit of trial and error on John, I guess.
Hi there.
But when he came back, I had a very firm idea of what we would do. I wanted to first start on a particular opioid called Suboxone, which would remove immediate high-level sort of ideas around potentially ending your own life, because John had mentioned that he didn't know whether or not he wanted to continue on. And Suboxone in particular had been found to be useful for this. And so I wanted to first remove that, and then we could sort of dig deeper. It didn't end up working very well for him because he had a very nausea-based version to that particular compound. It just made you ill, didn't it?
Yeah, it was even taking a quarter of the pill. I took it like one night before bed, and I could barely wake up at all the next day. And all I could do was sort of like get my eyes open, and if I moved, I threw up. And then it's like just kind of out of it for the day. And when we reduced the dose to like an eighth of a pill, I felt the sort of numbness that isn't even enjoyable. I just felt like I was half asleep, half awake.
Yeah.
And that itself, I actually found an unpleasant, upsetting experience. So it didn't have the effect we hoped.
And it's unfortunate I didn't agree with you. The rationale behind that compound is essentially that emotional pain and physical pain aren't that different in the brain. And so that type of painkiller that can kill physical pain can actually reduce emotional pain to a point where you are no longer in such suffering that you can start to move past certain things. At this point, if we had to go back to the beginning, I would probably use ketamine instead for that stage, because it's been found to have an effect of somewhere between 7 to 14 days of complete removal of suicidal thoughts or that type of severe grief-based depression. And that's
based on a particular dose, like a one-time thing, or is it?
Yeah, one-time dose. But we ended up moving on to the MDMA part of the therapy, which was for me to sort of observe and give John some sort of R&R in the form of having this, I guess, trip, and then following it up with sort of asking questions and just sort of being there emotionally for anything that might come up and talk out any things. But you want to sort of cover a bit more of what that felt for you and what particular you found interesting, I think.
For the MDMA process. Well, I had never experienced MDMA before. So the initial experience was like, this is awesome. But not just like, it's not awesome like, wow, this is so different. I just felt like me, like really me. Because it was as though, so my experience of it is often this sense of, this is really me without the worry and the fear. And so it doesn't feel like a sort of exaggerated, inauthentic version or some version jacked up to 11 on the meter. It just feels like me. And at first it was, just exciting to be feeling that. But then we tried a couple of these psychological, well, I was going to say games, I mean sort of serious games that lead to some deeper questions, such as the pickup artists use this thing called the cube, which is a cold reading technique where you ask somebody to do a visualization and you then analyze it. And it's quite remarkable in how much it can reveal about a person. And if you're doing it reveal about how they think about themselves, rather. And if you're doing it in person, then it's not simply that you look at, the reference book of they pictured it this way, so it means that. You can kind of sensitively guide the person around and see, is that bit ringing true? Is that not? Shall I back up here? Shall I go over there? That was an interesting tool, but not as interesting as this exercise that we've done on our podcast as well, called the Card 3 exercise, which takes you back, puts you to sort of a calm meditative state to begin. And then I won't do the whole exercise, but roughly speaking, you'll visualize yourself as a child in the first house that you can remember growing up in. And you think of your parents and you write down how you felt in their presence, imagining as you did back then, what you wished you wanted more of at that time. And negative traits you felt from your parents, the things that were your biggest frustrations. And towards the end of this process, the cards are kind of relabeled, and you begin to recognize that these patterns that were imprinted on you as a child, if the needs that you felt were unmet as a child, like, say, attention or being understood, if those are unmet now, even in adulthood, it's quite triggering, and it's likely that you'll continue to react in the ways that you did as a child and that your parents did around you. And this was pretty revelatory to me and sent me, I kind of needed like Dre to remind me what I had said, because so much had sort of come out and I would lose my clear memory of it. But it sent me off in a whole direction I didn't expect, because I thought, okay, I'm really depressed, suicidal. It's like I just feel worthless in and of myself. And yet by doing this process, we opened up the wonderful can of worms that, guess what? I've got daddy issues and mummy issues and broader family issues. But I simply didn't know that. Like I was actually unaware. It wasn't like repressed memories directly so much as the raw data had been left unprocessed in my mind and emotional life. And this gave me some powerful perspective on it.
And it was really, really interesting to sort of slowly peel away layer after layer and dig deeper between like each trigger and each negative loop and all the things that were going on underneath in a safe environment in the absence of fear. And that was the core of it. It was going through these cycles and then sort of capping them off with LSD experiences to allow the brain to integrate all of the lessons that the MDMA had brought forth. So it was sort of a repetition of, let's say, 4 or 5 MDMA experiences followed by LSD experience, mostly.
Well, I think it was more often mushroom experiences.
Mushrooms, yes, true.
That's an interesting concept to, use maybe LSD or mushrooms as a way to integrate some of the MDMA experiences, huh? Yeah.
And to allow the connections between different areas of the brain and the emotional centers that were uncovered to sort of weave and knit together with the rest of the mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've talked to a few people that have done like work in other countries or whatnot, but some people really like to use MDMA before kind of jumping into say mushrooms or LSD, or maybe they'll give it to somebody right beforehand.
That's a very different experience. I don't know if you've ever tried it. Have you ever?
No.
Mixed LSD and MDMA?
Yeah, that's really powerful, but it's very different from what we were doing. Whereas this has a very therapeutic kind of cycle to it. Taking both at the same time feels like neither, but both. And it feels like pure love, infinite energy of love pouring out of you. But it doesn't have the same therapeutic effect, I don't find. It's very pleasant, though.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, what I'm reading about often is people would perhaps do MDMA the day before their LSD session or mushroom session, kind of to loosen them up, maybe take down a lot of that character armor in Reichian terms there, and then allow the LSD to perhaps work more smoothly on the individual, maybe less speed bumps.
I would probably give it more of a week personally, purely because they interact with the same receptors in the brain in slightly different ways, and
right.
They tend to deplete a little bit. So if you give it a week to sort of rebuild up neurotransmitter levels and also sensitivity, you're more likely to get a better effect, I feel.
So would you typically give a week between sessions for people?
Yes.
Okay.
I think anything less than that and you start to reduce the efficacy of the whole thing.
Right. Anne Shulgin, her comments are like, you should use MDMA maximum 3 times a year. She's kind of coming from a place where she lost her ability to get high from MDMA. So she's kind of concerned for other people. But, the general rule of thumb for recreational people, I think, is 6 weeks for MDMA. But I could see in a therapeutic context it being okay to, go through 4 times, like, each week.
Yeah.
Once a week.
It depends what the goal is, right?
Right. If you're partying, it's a little different.
The best high possible and the most fun at a rave, then you want to give it a lot of time. But if you're trying to work through some serious issues, maybe I guess it depends on the protocol and level of care and what's happening around you.
Yeah. And the dosage, what kind of dosage would you use for MDMA typically?
Well, this is where we had to experiment because the dosage I would use on myself was way lower than what we ended up using on John because he doesn't seem to be very sensitive to it.
Huh.
It took a lot more for him. He can take quite a wallop, even in the early days, compared to what I require to get the same effect. But I would start someone on a low dose to see what, how they feel, which is sort of an in-between dose. It could be very high for someone on their first time, but it could also not be if they're not sensitive to it, which is about 100 milligrams. The highest I would personally ever go is 200. And seriously, at this point, it just feels a little too high for me. I'd rather do 150. But for John, sometimes he's like, yeah, this is doing nothing for me.
Yeah, I think at some point I ended up with at least on a redose of 350 or something.
Yeah.
Which it's one of those things that I think there's a little culture around it of oh, look how much you can take. I'm like, no, this is costing more money for one thing. And it's not cool to kind of, it can lead to more significant side effects too, like the nausea aspect.
Yeah, ideally you want to be able to have an effect with as little as possible.
Yeah, something interesting I learned about when I was doing part of the MDMA training was that this is for the people with PTSD, the people that had actually low doses kind of exacerbated some of their symptoms and their anxiety, just because that lower dose can just be kind of speedy without kind of that therapeutic aspect of processing. So yeah, it's interesting. You kind of want to find that medium dose where it's effective and not too just agitating.
Definitely, because at the lower doses, it starts to open up your emotional centers, but it hasn't suppressed the fear yet. So until you hit that removal of fear and anxiety, you are in a very vulnerable state, unless you've got a good therapist or friend coaching you through it. And even then, maybe. But it's better to sort of figure it out and get the right dose.
Yeah. And just to kind of backtrack, did this all happen after you came back from your ayahuasca experience, John?
Yeah, it was after, but not, I guess, immediately after that. I had the ayahuasca experiences, and I flew from Peru to Toronto, where I was there for about 2 months. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. and was there for about 2 months. But I was back around the Christmas period. And I gradually, as I was just feeling very much at breaking point. And as I walked back into DC airport, I thought, okay, am I going to commit to this path or am I going to go back? Am I going to try this therapy? Am I going to make that call? And I chose there and then because I entered the country on the visa waiver scheme instead of on the study visa that I would otherwise have been using. And that felt very liberating. And then it was a short time after that, having pulled the trigger, that Psychedelic Tuesdays began.
Yeah.
Every week for several months, which, a lot of people, even myself now, looking back, because I have my psychedelic experiences still, but pretty infrequently. Looking back, I'm like, oh, God, how did I possibly manage to, but maybe being naive to it and being very open to using this as a healing tool made it, me open to it in a way that if I had more preconceptions and experience, I wouldn't have been. One downside, though, I think, for me is that I now deeply associate even MDMA with doing deep personal work. So when I take MDMA, even if it's just for fun or for connecting with my boyfriend, I kind of have this niggling sense that, okay, is there anything important I need to talk about and need to get out of my head because this is a great opportunity? I mean, that's not a bad thing overall, but it would be nice to just let go a bit more and just enjoy the music. I guess that's a life lesson, actually.
I struggle with that too, because a lot of my deep work, early on, was just very intentional and kind of I really approached it kind of with the therapeutic aspect, and I mean I view it now just as that. I have a hard time just going into this work without doing that type of therapeutic work and intention. So I'm right there with you.
It's a funny one because it is always a beautiful opportunity, especially say with MDMA, where there's more chance, I think, to steer the experience into whichever realms. It is good to like say, is there anything on my mind? But not so much if it sort of feels like the itch that you can't scratch. Like, shouldn't I be? Isn't this? It's as though some part of me is like, surely there are more skeletons in this closet, and like beginning to scrape around in the back, thinking, has this closet got a false back and there's something else in there? It's a really strange sensation.
Yeah, actually, I think I mentioned this on a recent podcast that we just had talking about our experience in Jamaica, but during one of the high dose nights, somebody checked in with me, like a listener, and we were just chatting a little bit, and I asked them how their night was going or how it was going, and they said, it was good. I haven't been doing too much like digging into the personal stuff, and they're like, I'm really just kind of focusing on the here and now, and they're just like, I'm kind of at my age, at this time in my life, like I just want to enjoy the moment. Like I'm sick of kind of ripping these band-aids off and going in and doing this intentional work. I feel like I've been doing this for a while, and I just want to enjoy it. And that like hit me. I was like, damn, yeah, you're right. Like maybe part of the therapeutic aspect is just enjoying it in the moment, and not everything has to be so serious all the time.
I mean, it's kind of like doing, say, like an outdoor activity or challenge or something, maybe alone or with friends. And maybe the undertone is maybe you're going to learn something about yourself. Maybe you're going to discover how you overcome challenges or bond with your friends. But really, the point is in the moment that you're just going to have some fun.
It's interesting. For me, it was an interesting journey. So John had Psychedelic Tuesdays. There was a year where I did basically Psychedelic Saturdays. And I would take 1 to 2 drops of LSD every Saturday morning and just kind of experience it. And what I found was it felt like almost taking care of something. And the more I took care of it, the less it was required for it to be deep work. And it was kind of like tending and like trimming a bonsai. And once you got it perfect, it's beautiful. All you have to do is kind of, witness it rather than sort of fuss around with it. Right. And so my experiences became almost 100% beautiful, sort of revelation of the beauty of the universe and how happiness and joy, without having to think about anything specific or worry about how I'd been behaving or any of that stuff, because it'd been worked through in a way. And it was only, if something had happened that I needed to think about or work on, eventually that it might go back to being deep work. But it sort of felt like once you've expressed and tended to sort of your emotional garden, these compounds can become more of a beautiful journey rather than anything that you need to work on in a sort of a hard way.
I like that emotional garden. That's cool.
Yeah.
Good metaphor.
Part of that too, that brings up a connection for me, is that sometimes because there's a lot of thinky work and like revelations that can come up, but sometimes it can just be a case of an emotion needing to be expressed. I remember one mushroom trip afternoon where I just basically cried for 3 hours, and I didn't know why. And it kind of troubled me that I didn't know why.
I can't remember that conversation.
Yeah, like what is this sadness? And then somebody suggested, maybe it was you, maybe it was someone else, like, well, maybe that's just something that hadn't been expressed and needed to, and the source is now forgotten and doesn't really matter. It's just you needed to allow that pent-up emotional energy to come out.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely been experiences like that I've had and in breath work and stuff like that, where it's just, the emotions come up. I have no idea where it's coming from. There's no vision behind it. There's like no emotional charge besides that charge that just wants to be cathartically released. And and coming from like, that Groff model, it's like, we keep a lot of trauma and stored stresses in our body, and when we enter into these states we can release it. And that release doesn't always need to be attached to a certain thing. It just sometimes needs to be released from the body.
I mean, it's kind of like if you got something that's stressing you out or you're angry, hitting the punching bag of going for a run is what you need to do. It's not necessarily solving the problem that's causing the stress. It's changing your state.
Right. State change. I think that's a really important phrasing. Like states and stages, like kind of the integral model, I think is helpful. Maybe not 100% accurate, but I think helpful in modeling the discussion.
Sure, and all these are metaphors anyway
Right.
to try and explain, biochemistry and sort of electrics, into a human sort of comprehensible visual metaphor.
Do you think you have an estimate for micrograms in an individual drop of LSD, liquid LSD?
So the ones that I do are 125 micrograms per drop. I'm now happy somewhere between 125 and 250. More than that, and things get dicey. Like I made the mistake of not stirring and shaking and sort of making sure the dropper didn't have any pent over amounts in it, which had dried out and therefore uber concentrated on my last trip. And I have no idea how much I dosed. It might have been the highest I've ever dosed. That's how strong it was. And I didn't have a good time. I'm happier at medium doses now. I guess 250 is what most people consider a high dose. But for me, it kind of feels like the right spot. Maybe only 180, 200 would be best, actually. That's where I'll be happiest at.
Right. One thing we talk about a lot is that dosage, psychedelics don't appear to be dose dependent all the time, but with LSD, it does appear to be more that way than with some of the other compounds. But your personal inventory of what's going on for you and where you're at kind of feed into that. And I do think that because the science has been illegal for a long time, that we're still just kind of figuring all that stuff out, kind of being voices in the dark, if you will. Struggling to figure out what this stuff is.
Yeah, we're only seeing the very sort of preliminary, because the work they did like in the 60s and 70s was barbaric, really. It was almost non-scientific if you look at what the protocols were. But Robin Carr Harris, who I mentioned at Imperial College under the tutelage of David Nutt, has done some groundbreaking work in MRI imaging and all sorts of other things that have been showing which areas of the brains activate, which ones deactivate, the possible mechanism of action, and all sorts of other interesting things. So we're starting to get a little bit of an idea, and it's very exciting as well because it's revealing a little bit about how the brain works that perhaps we didn't realize.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I don't know. We'll just mention it, I guess. Kyle had the opportunity to chat with Robin yesterday, I think.
Oh, cool. Yeah, yesterday.
Had a really great conversation, and looks like we'll get him on the show soon, which is really exciting. Yeah, I've learned so much from him, even though he's, his model of reality doesn't necessarily match up with mine. But the cool part is he's a trained Freudian. Like his model of Freudian psychology does match up substantially with the Groff model of depth psychology. So that's really helpful for us to have a really nice overlap with a very impressive materialist.
Do you find that you guys particularly want there to be a model rather than sort of some guiding kind of attitudes or questions? Do you want there to find something that just kind of neatly explains these subjects?
I'd love that. If you look at transpersonal psychology and Groff's models, cartographies, I don't think there's too much neat about it. But, at least we have the personal, the perinatal, we have transpersonal states that are kind of paradigm bending. And that's pretty much it. And then you have all the Freudian stuff that bolts on there, and that's really helpful. It depends on what kind of therapy you're doing, right? If you're just letting the medicine do the work, the drug do the work, that's one thing. But if you're trying to act like a therapist in any way, I think it's really important to have some sort of model to work with when you're doing talk therapy with somebody. Maybe the model isn't 100% accurate. That's why most therapists, I think, jump between frameworks. They're not necessarily a Jungian or Freudian. They grab 20 different people and kind of synthesize for themselves what that looks like.
And it's interesting. Sometimes the reason why something works isn't what you think it is, but it works. So ultimately, it doesn't matter so much.
Yeah,
absolutely. Kyle, you could speak to that a little better than I could since you're in school for this stuff.
Just frameworks and theories.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I guess reflecting on this place that I worked at for early episode Psychosis, I went in there with a frame, obviously with Groff's model, spiritual emergence model, and kind of viewing it as that. And the place just had no model. All my theories went right out the window once you start working with people. It was just frustrating to me because I was but I have this framework to work with.
Patients are so inconsiderate.
What was that?
Patients can be so inconsiderate.
Yeah. But I mean, a lot of the stuff goes out the window when you start working with people because everybody's so individual. But what I found that like when the container wasn't there, it was really hard to figure out what we were doing. So like this place really didn't have a model besides like just being with people, which sounds really great. Obviously, that's a theory as well. But I mean, it just didn't feel like it created a container for exploring some of these states. So that kind of like tested me on how important like theory is and a framework is, but also how much that stuff also goes out the window. So yeah, I think it's a delicate balance. I just think having some sort of container to work with is just helpful. And, you know, it doesn't need to be dogmatic. You don't need to stick with it. But I think having an idea, you know, it's like that old saying, the map isn't the territory, right? But it's helpful to have a map so you can maybe understand the territory a little bit better.
Yeah, it reminds me of a sort of principle of how to understand Buddhist teachings, which is as though if you're trying to get to the far shore of enlightenment, you have a raft made of the Buddha's teachings. But as you gradually continue across and get closer to the other side, the raft just starts falling apart. And the more that you try and grasp and hold on to those particular models and structures, the less that you're going to be able to, because they have to fall apart for you to reach a whole different way of understanding. It's kind of the letting go of the model, having seen how it could lead you to your next stage of understanding.
I like that. Yeah.
I think there's a difference between practitioners and the experiencer too. So like, you know, for the therapist, you need a particular model, but for the experiencer, you need a little bit of training. But you're kind of right, because it becomes kind of formless. Like if you think about the 5-MeO experience, like how boundaryless and boundless that is, and purely infinite, like that is kind of hinting exactly at what the Buddha is talking about in a lot of ways. People can't talk about it, but I don't know if we want to go there.
Well, apparently we can't. What did Alan Watts say? Like he would try to F the ineffable, but
thank God somebody is. Yeah. So, are you trying to document this in any way, like in a blog or like a book or ebook or something, so people could maybe try to copy what you're up to and replicate your results?
Because of the illegality of it, and I don't want to. I mean, these are things that, if mishandled, can cause harm. I mean, some of them directly. An overdose of MDMA can kill you. LSD you can't die from, but you can die from doing stupid shit whilst on LSD. So I was a little bit hesitant to go and put any information where I don't have any level of control over how it's delivered. So written on a blog or anything like that, it's there for someone else to interpret without me coloring it anyway. So it's been mostly interpersonal. I talk about it to people that I care about and that I think could benefit from it. But no, I have not put it out publicly, other than on the podcast, describing my experiences, either on our podcast or on anyone else that wants to hear about it.
Although I've like here and there over the years been writing kind of the more experiential side, that at one point I thought, is this going to be like a book about ayahuasca? Is it going to be a book about these different kinds of chemicals, compounds, medicines, whatever we want to call them, that have particular effects? And I do want to get that out there, but I'm just not sure in what particular way, because it started life as, okay, it could be like a sort of a travel book into the self, going to the jungle, because I somehow thought the story would be complete in and of itself after my, one week of ayahuasca, which was entirely wrong. But on the other hand, there's a lot of books out there already which just have a chapter on, say, like, here's a chapter on ketamine, here's a chapter on mushrooms. So I don't know. I'm playing around. There's some stuff that I had put out about ayahuasca and about Vilka, a very powerful experience that I wrote for highexistence.com, if anyone fancies taking a look. But the book project, not too sure how it will manifest in the end.
We have been thinking of some form of training system. We were thinking sort of video-based e-learning type modules, which would bring all the lessons we've learned together. Some of them was psychedelic based, but it was just more of a broad program your mind or code your soul type set of teachings to help people build their own frameworks for cognition and understanding of the self and the world, and to therefore be better humans, which is the tagline of our podcast, Learning How to Human.
I really like that a lot. One thing I really want to see continue in the psychedelic world is furthering the democratization of psychedelic therapy in various ways. Like, that the executives are always going to be willing to pay, $50,000 for whatever they want at any point, but other folks might not even be able to pay $200 for a session, So how do we, help small cooperatives of less fortunate folks figure out how to learn this stuff and, maybe create therapeutic cooperatives? I don't know what that looks like, but I think the veterans in the US and probably in the UK, like, they need some help in the short term, and it's going to be years before the government lets us do it.
That's a really interesting idea, just because the way that I see it come out, mostly even like friends of mine have organized like psychedelic therapy or microdosing therapies in the Netherlands, where it is legal to do so. But the whole thing is pitched as like time to 10x yourself and 10x your company, entrepreneurs and future thinkers. And like, well, that's fine, that's cool, but the price tag is ridiculously prohibitive for just a couple of days. And like you say, that's not really a democratization of what can be very powerful therapeutic experiences for people who probably need them more than, the latest tech startup boss.
Absolutely. Like, PTSD doesn't feel good. I don't know what autism feels like, but I can assure you that it's probably fairly alienating. I have, family members who are autistic, so I relate to them in a different way than I would relate to a stranger in a park or something. So I don't know. There's a lot of suffering out there, and that's kind of like a Buddhist idea, is everything is suffering. But, I kind of think not everything is suffering. Sometimes it's pretty fun. But I don't
agree.
know. No one was with me last Saturday.
Yeah, I'm very against the fetishizing of any particular concept. Like, the moment someone's, the world, there is suffering in the world, and trying to ignore it and pretending like everything's good, or trying to strive to worlds without suffering completely is weird. But at the same time, identifying that, anything worthwhile is therefore suffering is also retarded, to be honest. And there's people that are just sort of hell bent on that side. It just doesn't make sense to me. There is so much beauty, and a lot of what has made the human experience great has been us trying to figure out how not to suffer. Everything we take for granted, including our laptops and iPhones and whatever we're using today to communicate, to do this podcast, was born out of a, original need to keep warm, to be fed, and to have lighting even when it was dark. Like, it's been a slow, gradual, let's try to make things a little bit easier and more comfortable. So to also renounce that seems as stupid to me.
Well, the whole like life is suffering thing, it doesn't mean what you just it's really hard to get my head around, but it's more to do with the idea that it's about the fetishization that you said is the problem of trying to get to some sort of idealized state,
right,
of a constant sense of slight or large dissatisfaction with right now, that, oh, it's nice that it's sunny. Oh, now I'm too hot. Shit, I better go in the shade. Oh, no, now I'm too good. Like, constantly wishing for the thing that isn't now. And that's not then meant to lead to just like, hey, I'm meditating forever on top of a mountaintop, impervious to everything else. It's about trying to let go of wishing for stuff that isn't there, if that kind of wishing is causing you suffering.
But I agree. But what I'm saying is that weird inability to let go of our suffering is perhaps what's resulted in some of the greatest inventions of all time. You have to have both. It's a weird combination. You have to accept that sometimes you'll be very unhappy, sometimes you'll be very happy, and trying to be one or the other is like, you need both.
Yeah.
Freaks.
If we're concerned about progress of the human race and the way we've seen it over the last couple thousand years, yeah, for sure.
True.
Hopefully we see more and more people doing philosophy, and we can kind of build on all of the psychedelic stuff that's happened over the last 100 years or so. I would love to see that develop quite a bit, and us have more useful stuff to chat about, or at least
Definitely,
more interesting stuff to chat about. That doesn't have to be useful.
Yeah. I call it raising the bar. Like every time something happens that changes society fundamentally, and a lot of people get upset and think that the world's just going to go down the toilet because now we don't have to worry about this thing that was important. Like industrialization allowed people to sort of live in a certain way, or now we're going to perhaps need universal basic income because there's not going to be any jobs, and people get freaked out by that. But every time it's happened in history, like the abolition of slavery and the removal of indentured work because we could afford to use machines, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise, I feel, meant that we were able to do all sorts of other crazy things. And I feel like the psychedelic revolution is going to be the jumping point towards sort of a further leap of what we're going to be talking about and working on, which I like to, in my mind, I like to think that I'll experience sort of the Star Trek type of, federation type mentality of improving humanity and improving the self.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
In my lifetime.
I would love to see it, man. Yeah. Yeah, what about that? Like, you're no longer concerned about buying a house and fixing the kitchen all the time. You can worry about refining your artistic skills and whatever, fencing, whatever the hell you want. That'd be fascinating. And this concept of we're on a spaceship Earth, like, I think that we're on one planet, we have limited resources, and we all got to get along, otherwise we all might die. Like, that kind of thing, I really hope we become more and more aware of over time. What are you guys excited about that you're seeing out there in the psychedelic field? Is there anything in particular outside of your own work that you're fascinated with?
I'm excited that I'm starting to see more types of research. There is initial research on autism and psychedelics that is starting to be done, both with the MDMA, but I think there's also a recent study on LSD and autism.
Is that mostly UCLA, or is that are you seeing that?
Oh, I can't remember, but
yeah,
something like that. Yeah, so
yeah. The MAPS is doing, or they finished up a research project on social anxiety with people on the spectrum. But yeah, I haven't heard about anything with LSD. I think there was some early studies.
Yes, exactly.
But I haven't heard anything recently. So that's interesting. I'd like to know more about that if you know where that's happening.
I can't remember. And I was genuine surprise at the fact that it was. And that's why I mentioned it as one of the things I'm excited about, is that it's starting to become accepted enough that people are playing with it. It's not so much of we've only got one shot to get this approved by the government. Let's make it super serious. Let's tie it to a concept that no one can refute, like the veterans helping their PTSD. Because, that for sure they'll allow through, hopefully, cross our fingers. It's because there's a few hurdles that have been overcome. It's a little bit more relaxed. And you know what? I'd really like to find out about, and, ABC or XYZ. And I'm excited by that level, because that's the level where interesting things happen. Just like Steve Jobs and Gates, playing with computers in their garage led to two companies that have changed the world. I think we're kind of getting there with psychedelics. It's the point of research where things are being played with. Yeah, that's the best way I can put it. So I'm excited by that.
Cool.
And Dre, I'm also curious too, how has your experiences maybe shifted the way that you identify with like your autism? Has it given you any insights on maybe what that's like for you, or what it could be like for other people, like autism in general, like being able to work through it in a psychedelic state?
I feel like I got a pretty good sense of it. And the way I feel is that now I have a foot in both worlds. It's not that I'm not I like to joke that it cured my autism, but autism is just a different way that your brain works. It never truly goes away, I don't think. But at the same time, it's no longer a prison. It's more of an almost intentional way of thinking. And at the same time, now I can see the other way of thinking, and it's being stimulated and activated. I think one of the things that happens in various brains is that whatever has the easiest time gets selected for. So in autism, logical, highly ordered thinking tends to reign supreme in a lot of us. And so the artistic, more sort of, chilled out part of the brain becomes dormant because it's never utilized very well. So it's like a muscle that doesn't get flexed. But the psychedelic experiences have sort of evened out. If you think of the mind like a bodybuilder that's only ever trained the right side, I feel like I've been training the left side, and now they're working together, and I'm getting sort of the benefits of both, but also the drawbacks of both every now and then.
Interesting. And John, do you have any I guess watching Dre grow over the years, like any insights or any feedback about that, like working with him?
Well, I didn't know him before he began the self-experimentation. I think, though, that from when we talked about how like people around you have responded, there's actually kind of a lag that I think we all can experience if we undergo some fundamental personal changes, that people continue to tend to remember their image of you from 10 years ago and treat you as though you are that thing, despite evidence to the contrary. So it can take, I guess, either time to catch up, or like it may even need to be like had out, like over the table. This is not me anymore. Please don't assume that I am that person and treat me as though this is the behavior that I'm performing, because look, I'm not actually doing it. But I think for Dre, there can be maybe a sort of gentle conflict between thinking, okay, things that are negative that I've done, it must be down to autism, or things that are really great that I do is also down to autism. That, because it's your state, it's at the core of how you think as a sort of framework. It's sort of an inescapable presence, and yet can also be sort of blamed or praised for things that I can look at and go, sounds like being a human, mate. It seems like if say some sort of romantic breakup or some sort of like misunderstanding with somebody, of course I can't know how you experience it fully, but the way that you've described some of these things sounds deeply familiar to me.
Yeah, I mean, we're all human. It's even the things that there's fundamental differences about are also kind of the same. Like, I don't know what a good analogy would be, but there's more between us that's the same than there is that is different. But sometimes it feels important to describe the differences, because those are the ones that result in difficulties in communication or expressing ideas or feeling misunderstood, because it's easy to empathize and recognize the similarities and avoid the differences. But the differences can make a huge impact in how you're personally able to overcome or deal with certain things. And so when someone says, "Oh, that's fine, that's just but that's just feeling sad. So what you do for that is X, Y, Z." It's like, no. For me, it's slightly different. This means that. And also for me, even if it was that, my way to fix that is not what your way to fix it is. It's this. So that it's kind of like, is the red that I see the same red that you see? Probably. Does it matter? No, because we both talk about that apple as being red. The problem comes when I go, yeah, that apple's red, and so is that tree. And you go, no, just the apple. I'm like, I see both the same. So it's this weird overlap between similarity and difference that's hard to quantify and describe for me. Like, I feel like I know what part of me is the different part, but yeah, you're right. It might be colored by my own perception, desire to blame it on something specific that's easier to objectify rather than a general, maybe.
It's like how I can just, perhaps it's like, I don't know, like me saying, well, this is because of depression or something. Like, to call it something is halfway to feeling like you've grasped it or can contain it. Whereas when it's something that is more nebulous, that's more intimidating, because we don't even know how we can begin to interact with it.
Yeah, as soon as you name the bird you find in the forest, it loses a lot of its more primal characteristics, I guess, that would be lost in that whole process of categorizing that animal into the whole scheme of other animals. And I think there's some sort of correlation there between, bigger ideas of how the mind operates and how the mind feels at times. Yeah, so that's really helpful, guys. Is there anything else you want to throw in here? We're at a little bit over an hour. Want to make sure you get as much of your ideas out there as you can, or at least some links to your sites.
John can rattle off all the links if he wants. In terms of ideas, I mean, there's so much to explore. It's the human experience and cognition and everything. There's just so much to life. So we could probably give you another 20 podcasts if you wanted. But I feel like we've covered this topic pretty well.
Cool. How about those links?
If you want to come over to Voices in the Dark, our site is voicesinthedark.world. We are spending more time on Facebook now that we started an actual discussion group there, which you can find via facebook.com/V-in-the-D. And at the moment, we're doing a couple of different series. Like every now and again, we dive back into the psychedelic realm. But we have a continuing interest in mental health and social dynamics and developing ourselves as humans. And our main two series at the moment, we have Sex and Relationships, which is proving pretty exciting, actually. A lot of feedback there.
People have a lot to say about what we're talking about.
And the Modern Stoic, where we're reading through various of Seneca's letters to Achilles and asking, well, do they really still have wisdom that can help us in the modern day? And guess what, everybody? Yes. But also sometimes, funnily, absolutely not, which, there's a lot of people getting on the Stoicism Renaissance bandwagon who think that absolutely everything in there is 100% useful right now. And we kind of more playful with it, a bit more. Yeah, our podcast is generally like we try to talk about serious things, but not be too serious in tone. We like to muck around too.
Well, John and Dre, thanks for joining us. Well, Kyle, anything else you want to add?
No, just thanks so much. It's been really fascinating to hear your story, and thanks for sharing it, Dre and John.
Yeah, can't wait to chat again.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Hope you enjoyed that episode, everybody. John and Dre from Voices in the Dark. Great episode, in my opinion, and very interesting ideas were spread there. I really want to dig into this idea of adult autism and treating it in an interesting way. I don't know too much about autism, but I know a number of folks that suffer from it, and it looks really tough not being able to interact with folks on their level, or some people that are just totally crippled by it and have never been able to even really communicate in their whole lives. So if there's some sort of fix for that, wouldn't that be amazing? These compounds that have been illegal to research for decades, yielding these kinds of magical results. So yeah, I think it was a really cool episode. Really look forward to chatting with these two dudes again. And yeah, I guess that's it for that. Something I didn't get to mention is we're still offering the DMTX webinar Psychonaut training for $99. So it's a donation to the DMTX research that Dana McQueen's going to be putting together with a team in the near future. And I think it's going to be really interesting. So keep an eye open for that. You can find that class over at psychedelicstoday.teachable.com or just come over to Psychedelics Today. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to shoot us an email, psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.